People often assume that someone who never apologizes simply lacks manners or humility. That explanation is appealing because it seems straightforward. If they would only admit they were wrong, everything could begin to improve. But when you observe emotionally abusive relationships over time, a different picture often emerges. The refusal to take responsibility is rarely an isolated habit. It becomes part of a broader pattern that protects the person's self-image, maintains influence within the relationship, and prevents meaningful accountability. This doesn't mean every person who avoids responsibility is emotionally abusive. Many people become defensive under stress, make excuses, or struggle to admit mistakes. Those behaviors can occur in otherwise healthy relationships and can improve with self-awareness and effort. The concern arises when denying responsibility becomes persistent, inflexible, and intertwined with manipulation, intimidation, or repeated harm to another person. One of the first things to notice is that responsibility and blame are not the same. Responsibility asks, what was my role in this situation? Blame asks, who can I make carry the discomfort? Someone committed to responsibility can acknowledge mistakes without believing they are fundamentally worthless. Someone focused only on blame often experiences mistakes as threats to their identity. Instead of examining what happened, they instinctively search for somewhere else to place the emotional weight. Imagine two people who arrive late to an important meeting. The first says, I underestimated the traffic. Next time I'll leave earlier. The second says, the traffic was ridiculous. The directions were confusing. Nobody told me construction had started. Besides, everyone else is late too. Both encountered the same obstacle. Only one examined their own contribution. That difference becomes much more significant in emotionally abusive dynamics because the same thinking appears again and again. When confronted about hurtful behavior, the conversation often shifts almost immediately. You made me yell. If you hadn't pushed my buttons, this wouldn't have happened. You're too sensitive. I was only joking. You completely misunderstood me. Notice what these responses have in common. None begin with curiosity. None begin with reflection. Instead, they redirect attention away from personal responsibility and towards someone else's quest, reaction, intention, or supposed flaw. A useful way to understand this is to think about psychological self-protection. Most people want to see themselves as decent, reasonable, and justified. When evidence threatens that self-image, it creates internal discomfort. Psychologists often describe this kind of discomfort as cognitive dissonance, a tension between how someone sees themselves and information that suggests otherwise. People resolve that tension in different ways. Some acknowledge the mistake and adjust their behavior. Others reinterpret events until they no longer feel responsible. Neither response is unique to emotionally abusive individuals. The difference is frequency, rigidity, and impact. In abusive patterns, externalizing responsibility becomes the default strategy, rather than the occasional exception. This is why conversations can begin to feel strangely circular. You raise a concern, they explain why your concern isn't valid. You provide examples. They question your memory. You clarify your intentions. They criticize your tone. Eventually, the original issue disappears. Hours later, you're defending yourself instead of discussing the behavior that started the conversation. This shift rarely happens by accident. Whether consciously or unconsciously, changing the subject from behavior to your reaction often protects the other person from accountability. Another important pattern is selective memory. People generally remember events in ways that fit the stories they tell themselves. That's a normal human tendency. Under stress, however, this tendency can become even stronger. Someone who struggles with accountability may genuinely remember themselves as the victim in situations where others experience them very differently. That doesn't automatically mean they're intentionally lying. Memory is reconstructive. Emotion influences recall. Personal bias influences interpretation. But regardless of intention, the practical effect can still be deeply confusing for the other person. You begin wondering whether your recollection is accurate. You start keeping text messages, saving emails, replaying conversations repeatedly in your mind, not because you enjoy doing so, but because your confidence in your own perception has gradually weakened. This is one reason emotionally manipulative relationships can become psychologically tingling. The conversation is no longer only about what happened. It's about whether what happened at all. When reality itself becomes negotiable, certainty becomes difficult to maintain. Another mechanism worth understanding is projection. Projection occurs when someone attributes unwanted thoughts, motives, or feelings to another person. Imagine someone who frequently behaves in controlling ways, accusing everyone else of trying, to control them, or someone who regularly withholds information, insisting that everyone around them is dishonest. Projection isn't always deliberate. Sometimes people genuinely struggle to recognize characteristics within themselves while noticing them quickly in others. Regardless of intention, projection changes conversations. Instead of examining their own conduct, attention moves toward defending against accusations. Again, accountability quietly disappears. Another reason responsibility can feel so threatening is that some individuals equate admitting one mistake with admitting total failure. Their internal thinking becomes all or nothing. If I was wrong here, then maybe I'm a terrible person. Because that conclusion feels unbearable. Even small corrections become emotionally dangerous. From the outside, refusing to apologize may look like confidence. Internally, it can sometimes reflect fragile self-protection. Understanding this distinction doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it can explain why logical evidence often fails to produce meaningful change. Facts alone rarely overcome defenses built to protect identity. This is also why escalating the argument with more evidence often produces diminishing returns. You present another example. They produce another explanation. You present another witness. They question motives. You provide documentation. They change the topic. Eventually you realize the disagreement isn't really about information. It's about whether responsibility will be accepted. In healthy relationships, new information can change someone's position. In chronically unhealthy dynamics, new information often becomes new material to reinterpret. Pay attention to how apologies function. A meaningful apology usually contains several elements: recognition of the specific behavior, acknowledgement of its impact, acceptance of responsibility, a commitment to different behavior moving forward. Without those components, apologies can become performative. I'm sorry you feel that way. I'm sorry, but you made me angry. I'm sorry if you misunderstood. Notice how responsibility quietly disappears. The words sound conciliatory. The structure avoids ownership. This distinction matters because reconciliation depends not only on hearing the word sorry, but on seeing genuine accountability followed by behavioral change. One apology rarely rebuilds trust. Consistent actions do. Another pattern appears when consequences enter the picture. Imagine someone repeatedly violates an agreed boundary. Eventually, the other person decides to create distance. Suddenly, the conversation shifts. You're abandoning me. You're overreacting. You're punishing me. The focus becomes the consequence rather than the behavior that produced it. This reversal can create enormous guilt. People begin questioning whether enforcing healthy limits is somehow unfair. But consequences and punishment are not automatically the same thing. Punishment seeks revenge. Consequences acknowledge that repeated behavior affects relationships. If trust decreases after repeated dishonesty, that's a consequence. If someone chooses greater distance after repeated disrespect, that's a consequence. Understanding this difference can help people maintain boundaries without unnecessary guilt. Perhaps the most important insight is that responsibility isn't demonstrated by words alone. It's demonstrated by patterns. Anyone can say, "I'll do better." The more meaningful question is, what happens next? Do conversations become more respectful? Does the harmful behavior decrease? Does empathy increase? Does accountability become more consistent? Lasting change is usually visible in repeated actions, not isolated promises. And once you begin paying attention to patterns rather than isolated incidents, many confusing interactions start making much more sense. Once you begin looking at patterns instead of isolated moments, another important shift takes place. You stop asking, "Why did this argument happen?" and begin asking, "What role does this argument play?" That question often reveals something you couldn't see when you were focused only on the latest disagreement. In healthy relationships, conflict usually serves a constructive purpose. Two people identify a problem, exchange perspectives, search for common ground, and ideally leave with greater understanding. The conflict has a direction. It moves toward resolution. In emotionally abusive dynamics, conflict can begin to serve a different function. Instead of resolving problems, it repeatedly protects an existing pattern. The conversation becomes less about finding truth and more about avoiding accountability, preserving control, or maintaining a particular image. As a result, the same issues return again and again because they were never genuinely addressed in the first place. One clue that this is happening is the absence of genuine curiosity. Think about the difference between these two responses. The first person says, "Help me understand why that hurt you." The second says, "You're making a big deal out of nothing." The first response seeks information. The second dismisses experience. Curiosity is one of the strongest indicators that someone is open to learning something they didn't already believe. Dismissiveness often signals that the person's primary goal is ending the discussion rather than understanding it. Another pattern worth noticing is how criticism is distributed. Healthy relationships allow criticism to move in both directions. Both people can acknowledge mistakes. Both people can receive feedback. Neither person is permanently assigned the role of being the problem. In unhealthy dynamics, criticism often flows almost entirely one way. One person becomes the constant evaluator. The other becomes the constant defendant. If every difficult conversation ends with one person apologizing while the other never examines their own behavior, that's a pattern worth paying attention to. Accountability depends on mutual reflection. Without it, the relationship gradually becomes unbalanced. Another communication habit that protects people from responsibility is changing the standard. Imagine you're told you don't communicate enough. You begin communicating more. Now you're told you're communicating too much. You adjust again. Now the complaint changes entirely. No matter what you do, the expectation shifts. Psychologists sometimes describe this as moving the goalposts. The specific criticism changes, but the underlying experience remains the same. You're always trying to catch up to a standard that never stops moving. This creates confusion because success becomes impossible to measure. If the rules constantly change, confidence slowly erodes. Instead of evaluating your behavior objectively, you begin evaluating yourself according to someone else's shifting expectations. That uncertainty can become emotionally exhausting. Another dynamic involves certainty. People often assume that whoever sounds the most confident must know what they're talking about. In reality, confidence and accuracy are separate things. Someone can speak with complete conviction while making inaccurate assumptions. Someone else may speak carefully and still be correct. This matters because emotionally intense conversations often reward certainty over not. Statements like, "I know exactly what you're thinking," or "everyone agrees with me," sound authoritative, but they don't necessarily reflect reality. One useful habit is quietly asking yourself, what evidence supports this claim? That question encourages critical thinking without requiring immediate confrontation. It keeps you connected to observable facts rather than emotional momentum. Another reason responsibility becomes difficult for some people is that acknowledging mistakes requires emotional resilience. Admitting error creates temporary discomfort. Avoiding responsibility may create immediate relief. Our minds naturally prefer short-term comfort. But over time, avoiding accountability usually creates larger relationship problems. The irony is that responsibility often strengthens trust. When someone says, "You're right. I handled that poorly. I'll work on it," they don't usually appear weaker. They often appear more trustworthy. People tend to respect individuals who can acknowledge mistakes without collapsing under shame. This is why humility and confidence are not opposites. Healthy confidence doesn't require perfection. It allows room for correction. One subtle pattern that deserves attention is selective empathy. Some people expect extraordinary understanding for their own difficult days while showing very little understanding for yours. When they lose their temper, there's always a reason. When you become upset, it's treated as a character flaw. Notice the imbalance. The standards applied to themselves differ from the standards applied to others. Mutual empathy means extending the same generosity in both directions. Another practical observation concerns timing. Have you ever noticed how some conversations seem impossible to have in the moment? You raise a concern. The discussion immediately becomes about your delivery. Later, when you raise it calmly, you're told the issue is old and should have been forgotten. When you bring it up privately, you're told it should have been discussed publicly. When you mention it publicly, you're criticized for embarrassing someone. No timing is ever acceptable. This creates another impossible standard. Recognizing impossible standards is important because they often keep people trapped in endless self-correction. Instead of asking whether the concern itself is valid, they're constantly trying to discover the perfect way to express it. Sometimes that perfect way never arrives because the issue was never really about timing. It was about avoiding the conversation altogether. Another useful question is, what happens after accountability is requested? In healthy relationships, accountability may feel uncomfortable, but it eventually leads somewhere. Clarification, repair, changed behavior. In unhealthy dynamics, accountability often produces distraction. The conversation expands, old grievances appear, unrelated topics surface, the emotional intensity increases. Notice the direction. One path moves toward resolution. The other moves away from it. Understanding that difference helps explain why some conversations feel productive while others leave you more confused than when they began. You may also notice an increasing focus on intentions over impact. Suppose someone says something hurtful. You explain how it affected you. Instead of discussing the impact, they repeatedly insist, "That wasn't my intention." Intentions matter. Impact matters too. Healthy communication usually makes room for both. A person can acknowledge that their intentions were good while still recognizing that the outcome caused harm. When impact is consistently dismissed because the intention was supposedly harmless, opportunities for learning become limited. One of the strongest indicators of emotional maturity is the ability to separate identity from behavior. Instead of thinking, "If I made a mistake, I must be a terrible person," emotionally resilient people learn to think, "I made a mistake, and I can do better." That distinction creates room for growth. Without it, every correction feels like a personal attack. And if every correction feels like an attack, defensiveness becomes almost inevitable. Perhaps the most valuable perspective is remembering that understanding someone's behavior doesn't require accepting it. You can recognize that a person's defensiveness may come from insecurity, learned habits, fear of shame, or long-standing coping strategies. That understanding may increase compassion. It doesn't eliminate the need for healthy boundaries. Compassion and boundaries can exist together. In fact, they often work best together. Compassion reminds you that human behavior is complex. Boundaries remind you that complexity doesn't erase responsibility. Both ideas can be true at the same time. As you become more familiar with these patterns, conversations begin to look different. You become less focused on isolated statements and more attentive to recurring processes. Who reflects? Who redirects? Who repairs? Who repeats? Those questions often reveal more about the health of a relationship than any single argument ever could. Another pattern begins to stand out once you stop focusing on individual arguments and start observing how disagreements end. Ask yourself a simple question. After conflict, does the relationship become healthier, or does it simply become quieter? Those are not the same thing. Silence can sometimes look like peace from the outside, but internally it may be the result of one person deciding that speaking up no longer feels worthwhile. When concerns are repeatedly dismissed, minimized, or turned back against the person raising them, many people gradually stop expressing themselves. The absence of conflict then gets mistaken for harmony, when in reality it reflects resignation rather than resolution. This is one reason long-term emotional abuse can be so difficult to recognize. There may not be constant shouting. There may not be dramatic confrontations every day. Instead, there is a gradual narrowing of one person's emotional freedom. They begin editing their words before speaking. They rehearse conversations in advance. They predict how the other person will react and reshape their own behavior to avoid another exhausting discussion. Over time, this constant self-monitoring becomes automatic. They ask themselves questions like, "Is it worth bringing this up? Maybe I'm remembering it wrong. I'll just let it go. I don't want another argument." Individually, those thoughts may seem ordinary. Everyone avoids unnecessary conflict from time to time. The concern arises when those thoughts become the default response to nearly every important decade-or issue. Something else worth noticing is how responsibility affects trust. Trust is often described as believing another person will tell the truth or keep their promises. That's certainly part of it, but trust also depends on predictability. You trust people whose actions consistently align with their words. Imagine someone who says, "I'll work on my temper." If the next disagreement looks exactly like the previous 10 disagreements, confidence naturally declines. Not because the promise sounded insincere, because observable behavior didn't change. Behavior is where accountability becomes visible. Words introduce change. Actions confirm it. Another useful distinction involves explanation versus justification. Suppose someone says, "I've been under a lot of pressure at work lately." That may help explain why they were unusually irritable. Explanation provides context. Justification attempts to remove responsibility. "I've been under pressure, so you shouldn't expect me to treat you respectfully." Those are two very different messages. Healthy communication can acknowledge difficult circumstances without using them as permanent exemptions from respectful behavior. Everyone experiences stress. Everyone has difficult seasons. The question is not whether pressure exists. The question is whether pressure becomes a reason to stop taking responsibility for the effects of our actions. One communication habit that often keeps unhealthy patterns alive is chasing certainty. People naturally want answers. Why did they say that? Did they mean to hurt me? Will they ever change? Those questions are understandable. But sometimes the search for certainty keeps people focused on explanations instead of observable patterns. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen?" Consider asking, what keeps happening? That shift moves your attention toward evidence rather than speculation. Patterns usually provide more reliable information than isolated intentions. Another feature of emotionally abusive dynamics is inconsistency. Affection may appear unexpectedly after periods of tension. Promises may follow major conflicts. Kindness may increase immediately after boundaries are enforced. These moments can create hope, and hope is an important human experience. The challenge is remembering to evaluate consistency rather than intensity. A very positive weekend does not automatically erase 6 months of recurring disrespect. Likewise, one difficult week does not define an otherwise healthy relationship. Looking at longer-term patterns helps prevent emotionally charged moments from overshadowing the broader picture. Another reason responsibility matters so much is that it creates emotional safety. Think about someone you trust deeply. Chances are they aren't perfect. They've probably made mistakes. What separates them is often their willingness to acknowledge those mistakes without forcing someone else to carry them. That willingness creates confidence. You know that if something goes wrong, the conversation can move toward repair rather than denial. Repair is one of the strongest predictors of healthy relationships. Conflict itself isn't necessarily destructive. Relationships become stronger when people can recognize harm, discuss it honestly, and make meaningful adjustments. Without repair, small injuries accumulate. Over time, unresolved experiences begin influencing every new disagreement. Another subtle pattern involves language. Pay attention to how often absolute words appear. You always, you never, everyone thinks, no one agrees with you. Absolute language often exaggerates reality. Very few people literally always or never do anything. These words increase emotional intensity while reducing precision. Replacing absolute statements with specific observations usually produces more productive conversations. Instead of saying, you never listen, someone might say, when I was speaking earlier, I felt interrupted. Specific observations invite discussion. Broad character judgments often invite defensiveness. Something else to consider is emotional responsibility. Each person is responsible for managing their own emotional reactions. Other people influence our emotions, but influence isn't the same as control. This distinction matters because emotionally abusive communication often blurs that line. Statements like, you made me lose control, suggest that responsibility for one person's clow's behavior belongs entirely to someone else. Healthy accountability sounds different. I became angry. I handled that poorly. I need to respond differently next time. Notice how responsibility remains connected to the person taking the action. Another important question involves reciprocity. When you apologize, what happens? When they apologize, what happens? Are both people willing to examine themselves? Or does accountability consistently travel in one direction? Balanced relationships don't require equal mistakes. They require equal willingness to reflect. Mutual accountability creates resilience, because neither person is permanently assigned the role of being flawless or permanently at fault. Over time, you may notice that emotionally healthy people tend to ask more questions than they answer. What did you mean by that? Can you help me understand? What could I have done differently? Questions signal openness. Declarations often signal certainty. Neither is inherently good or bad, but curiosity usually creates more opportunities for growth than certainty alone. One final perspective worth carrying forward is that responsibility isn't primarily about admitting failure. It's about protecting the future of the relationship. Every sincere acknowledgement of harm communicates something important. Our connection matters more to me than defending my ego. That message builds trust. Without it, conversations gradually become competitions over who is right rather than collaborations focused on what is true. And once conversations become competitions, learning slows, defensiveness increases, and meaningful change becomes much harder to achieve.